At our core, we are outcome driven beings. I think that in our day to day lives, we are constantly analyzing and attempting to seek out positive outcomes and avoid adverse outcomes. I think that so much of life just boils down to exactly that, if not all of it. And as a result, I want to talk a little bit about that core part of being human. When I think about the ways that an outcome comes about, assuming that we are outcome driven entities, I think it all begins with a feeling. And I think that the chain goes feeling to action to outcome, right? And you can think of this as really simple stuff like hungry to eat food to no longer hungry. All of life, I think, to a certain extent, boils down to this. And what makes it interesting, or what makes it curious to me, is I think that our feelings are evolutionarily programmed. And what I mean by that is that you can think of feelings as flashcards that are passed down from our most successful ancestors. And we'll talk a bit more about successful, quote unquote, in a second. But as a population exists, the most successful members of it survive because of the traits that they have, because I would argue the feelings that they have lead to actions that lead to outcomes that are desirable and successful. And in the world of population genetics, that heuristic for determining success is very one-dimensional, right? It is, did they pass their genes on to the next generation? Did they reproduce? And while that is a very narrowly defined success criteria / heuristic, it works super well for humans, has historically and continues to, because so many, if not all, of the most important facets of our lives are correlated around that, right? You don't pass on your genetics if you don't survive long enough. So there are a ton of corollary / universe around reproduction concepts that make it sort of the perfect heuristic for getting us to where we are here. When I think about those corollary things, I think they take on a huge swath of different structures, right? You have the best hunter-gatherer provides the most for his or her tribe. The most creative one invents the wheel and starts grinding grain with it. The most anxious one avoids getting eaten by the tiger. So all of these traits that they have caused them to survive. And then those traits get passed on to the next generation as a handy cheat sheet of you are more likely to survive and not get eaten by a tiger if you follow these 3 simple steps. This line of thinking isn't mine. I don't want to claim that I just kind of, was like sitting on the toilet and came up with this. In fact, I read a book, I guess now it's a couple years ago, called Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. And it is an incredible book that I could not recommend highly enough. And I will make more videos about more snippets of brilliance that came out of this book. But if I were to describe in as few words as possible the core premise of the book, I think it is asking the question, how do we know if our feelings are true? And that is a problematic statement that the author acknowledges the problematicness of. But at its core, what he is talking about in the book, I think, is the question of adaptive and maladaptive feelings. To put a finer point on that, you can think of a adaptive feeling as a feeling that serves you. You have a feeling, it leads to an action, that action leads to an outcome that is positive for you, right? You are hungry. That's your feeling. The action is you eat dinner, and the outcome is you are no longer hungry. Whereas a maladaptive feeling might be you are hungry and the thing that you crave is chocolate pudding. You eat a large amount of chocolate pudding and you find yourself with diabetes. So the idea or the premise is that if our feelings are these cheat sheets left by our ancestors, it's not always guaranteed that what worked for them will work for us. In the book, he covers this idea that sugars, in particular, were something that in human history have been very scarce and today are very prevalent, right? You can go to any grocery store and buy a cherry Coke and have all the sugar you could ever want immediately. Whereas way back in history, that was not the case. And so having an adaptive behavior towards wanting sugar back then didn't lead to things like obesity and diabetes. But today, it's a very different case because the world has changed and the cheat sheet has remained the same. And I think this gets a little more interesting and is best explained by another example that the author gives, which surrounds the idea of danger. And it's been a while, so I'm going to kind of give my version in my head of the story that he told, and it might not be exactly correct. But you imagine you have a person long ago that traveled through the woods on a daily basis. And every day they would hear a rustling in the bushes and they would turn around and check to see if it was a snake. And the human mind is very powerful. And so in that moment, it would deploy a whole bunch of countermeasures against the potential that there is a snake. It would raise their heart rate and blood pressure so that they're ready to spring into action and battle the snake or whatever it is you do with snakes. And regardless of whether the snake is there, the person might momentarily see a twig that pattern matches to a snake because that is useful to identify the threat as quickly as possible. And so we have this person, and every day the rustling is the wind moving leaves. And yet every day their heart rate rises up incredibly high and they brace for battle and to survive. In evolution's eyes, this is amazing, right? This is best case scenario. This is maximizing the likelihood that this individual will survive. And that's all that matters, right? That's the singular heuristic. If this person leads a staggeringly stressed and anxious life, but they get to create offspring, evolution is like, that's a win. And if this person leads a super chill life and then gets bit by a snake and dies, evolution is like, that was a failure. You don't get to pass along your index cards that included things like breathe, don't freak out, and things like that. So in this way, you can see how the anxiety is somewhat maladaptive at the time, if you think about things not in a strictly evolutionary perspective. If your heuristic includes things like quality of life, for instance, then this behavior is not serving the person. But it is the behavior that gets passed on generation after generation. And once commutes no longer have snakes, the quick reference card that says, oh, you heard something, it must be a snake, is not useful to people in today's world where we probably go years at a time, mostly without seeing snakes unless we go to a zoo. So the idea that our feelings are, in some cases, maladaptive is a fascinating idea. And the reason that I find it so personally fascinating is that I have for a long time trained myself, or at least had an inner narrative, that it is important to accept our feelings, right? Don't, like avoid cognitive dissonance, avoid pushing your feelings away, feel your feelings. And the premise that the author is presenting here is be suspicious of your feelings. Think about your feelings and whether they serve you. And it is his argument that this is what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is the ability to hold a feeling in the palm of your hand and ask the question, does this feeling serve me? Right? Essentially breaking the I am a slave to my feelings paradigm, and instead being able to examine a feeling and determine if it leads to the kinds of outcomes that I actually want. So that's the truth of feelings concept. And I think it's a very powerful one, and it described to me some of these concepts in a way that I had not thought about them before and that I found very exciting. The reason that I'm bringing it up now is because I had a really interesting experience a couple of months ago that brought me back to this concept, and in a very interesting sort of way. The experience was that I was watching a YouTube video of an interview between a psychologist and a Twitch streamer named Sweet Anita, who happens to have Tourette syndrome. And I'm no expert on Tourette syndrome, and I don't want to present as one. My very basic understanding prior to hearing her talk a bit about it was that Tourette syndrome is very much about involuntary verbal and nonverbal tics. And what I learned from this interview, among many other things, was that there is another facet to Tourette syndrome that is something called tic rage, where a tic is the way that you refer to those involuntary actions. And tic rage is essentially when a person with Tourette syndrome feels a very strong feeling that is incongruent with the situation that they are in, right? They might get very angry during a tender moment or something like that. And what was so fascinating about this was the way that she described dealing with tic rage. And what she said, and I'm paraphrasing again here, is that she always sits beside her feelings before accepting them in, because she needs to be innately suspicious of her feelings because sometimes they are not true and not serving her. And the reason that this was so exciting to me was because I was kind of sitting there gobsmacked being like, is this woman like a Buddhist master, essentially, right? Has she mastered mindfulness? Because what she is describing is in a lot of ways my understanding the pinnacle of what Robert Wright in Why Buddhism is True described as mindfulness, right? This ability to take a feeling and examine it so clearly and so clear-headedly, dispassionately, and ask the question, does this serve me? Is this a true feeling? And the conclusion that I came to is that I think there is a lot to learn from this. And I think that the choice to be mindful, to inspect our feelings, to not be enslaved by our feelings, and to be able to accept and reject our feelings based on whether they create and push us towards outcomes that truly benefit us, is something that should be on everyone's plate. I think that everyone would do well to be more scrutinizing and sometimes suspicious of the feelings that they feel in their day-to-day life. And so I know that this isn't the classic definition of mindfulness, nor is this a how-to guide. But I wanted to talk about it because it is a thing that I think about on a daily basis. And I strive to be more mindful in my life. And I wanted to share that with anyone interested in hearing a little bit about the way that I think about mindfulness. So with that, thank you for watching as always. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Not apotamus. Ponderous.